The sun shone brightly as the birds chirped, singing their songs as a soft breeze blew against her face. It was a beautiful start to a normal day, especially for Daisy. Being King Ben and Queen Mal's daughter was fun for the most part, but came with a lot of responsibilities. It was a nice change to have a breather and to soak in the sun. She rarely had the time for herself, especially when she attended her classes at Auradon Preparatory and tried to solve disputes amongst the residents of both Auradon and the Isle of the Lost. Ever since her mom bridged the two lands, many of the villain kids had their own happily ever after, but that didn't stop them from having problems with one another. So Ben and Mal enacted a council. It had members from both Auradon and Isle of the Lost. Evie, Jay, Carlos, Uma, Audrey, Jane, Lonnie, and Doug were the ones who landed on the council. They all managed their land affairs, making sure everyone was behaving and being kind. They made sure everything was equal for everyone, which worked out. Funnily enough, Daisy was close friends with the children of the council members, just like her mom was. Evie's daughter Jade was her best friend. They carried on the original Villain's Kid legacy, though they always got caught when they were doing something naughty. It was as if her mom always knew what they were going to do, even when Daisy tried her best to sneak away with it. Daisy looked up from the book of spells her mom gave her to see Jade walking toward her and taking a seat next to her on the green grass. Jade smiled happily and said, "Isn't it nice out?" "Yeah," Daisy said, nodding as she looked back at the book. "I found a spell to make my hair a different color. Want to try it out with me?" "No," Jade said. "Your spells are always backfiring. The last time we tried one, I was stuck as a gerbil for a week. I will not do that again." "Oh, come on, it wasn't that bad," Daisy said as she giggled. The look on Jade's face was priceless. "Okay, fine, it was awful." "You still haven't gotten control over your magic, huh?" Jade asked seriously. "No," Daisy said. Her heart sank as she thought about it. Her magic was unpredictable and never really worked the way she wanted it to. Why couldn't her magic be like her mom's? All the stories she heard about her mom's magic sounded great and powerful, and it hurt knowing that Daisy didn't have proper control. "It's okay, you'll get the hang of it," Jade said, smiling at her friend. "But in the meantime, you want to try on a new dress I made? My mom loved the design." "Sure. Does later work? I have class," Daisy said with a big grin on her face. Jade surely got her mom's talent for fashion and design. It was amazing. The two girls waved at each other, saying goodbye before heading off to class. "Have a good day," Jane said before hopping off towards her class. Once Daisy arrived at her Good Spells and Magic, taught by Jane, Fairy Godmother's daughter, she saw that everyone was staring at her with wide eyes. Ignoring their looks, she shrugged it off and took a seat. When Jane arrived, she looked panicked and asked for Daisy to come with her. "What's going on?" Daisy asked Jane, who was speeding now through the hallway. "There's been a royal emergency," Jane said. "We tried to contain it, but it seems it has gotten around to the student body." "What's the emergency? Why aren't you getting my mom and dad?" Jane turned to look at her, her face grim and full of despair. "Something awful has happened. Please, just follow me." Daisy shut up and instead followed Jane down the halls of Auradon Preparatory and towards the castle rooms. Usually, the hallways were packed with kids, but this time it was empty. Nothing and no one was in sight for miles as they made their way into the council room. It sent a shiver down Daisy's spine, seeing those familiar corridors look so dead. She knew that something horrible must have happened for them to be so empty. As they entered the council room, she saw all the members there, waiting for her around the table. Evie ran up to her, hugging her tightly. Her blue hair tickled Daisy's face as she pulled her into the embrace, whispering, "Oh, sweetheart, it's going to be okay." "Aunt Evie, what's going on?" she asked, this time demanding that someone tell her what's going on. Doug, Evie's husband, turned to her with eyes and said, "You mean you don't know what's happened?" "No," Daisy said. "It seems I'm the only one who doesn't, and nobody wants to tell me." As she spoke, the giant doors to the room swung open to reveal Queen Mal, her mom. She usually wore her purple and green dress, but today she wore her jumpsuit. Daisy knew she only wore this when she went out on life-threatening missions. "Will someone tell me what's going on?" Daisy yelled, getting tired of being ignored. Nobody was telling her anything, and it was driving her insane. Didn't she deserve to know what was going on? Why does everyone look so nervous? Her mother looked at her, shaking her head as she sighed. Mal turned to look at everyone else and said, "Please let me speak to my daughter alone." Daisy scrunched her eyebrows, confused, as she watched the council members exit the room. Before Evie left, she whispered into her ear, "It's going to be okay, I promise." What was going to be okay? What happened that was so bad? Nervously, she waited. As she looked around, she noticed that everyone was there except for her dad. King Ben was missing from the room. She could feel her heart drop to the pit of her stomach, almost as if she knew what Mal was going to say. "Sweetheart," Mal said as she reached out and brushed Daisy's purple hair behind her ear, "something's happened to your father." "What happened?" Daisy asked, her heart racing in her chest. Her hands shook by her sides as Mal motioned for her to take the seat beside her. "First, I don't want you to worry, okay?" That only made Daisy even more anxious. How could people expect her not to worry when clearly something had happened? Daisy took a deep breath and nodded, watching her mom through wide eyes. Mal continued, "I promise that everything will be okay." The suspense was killing Daisy. It felt as if everyone was walking on eggshells around her, and she hated it. Whatever the news was, she knew she could take it. She was stronger than everyone was giving her credit for. "Please, just tell me," Daisy said. Her voice was firm as she nodded. She tightened her jaw, scrunching her brows. Before Mal had spoken, Daisy had a sinking feeling she knew what was going on. Her mom would never hold a meeting like this without the love of her life, and Daisy's father. Mal said, "Your father was kidnapped." "What do you mean he's been kidnapped?" Daisy asked, shaking her head. "By who?" Daisy's heart dropped to the pit of her stomach as she ruminated in her thoughts. After her parents bridged Aradon and the Isle of the Lost, their citizens had become happier. Many of the villain kids and their parents turned over a new leaf and began changing their ways. None of them would go out of their way to kidnap Ben, would they? She couldn't believe what she heard. It just didn't make sense. As Daisy asked her question, Mal smacked her lips, shaking her head. This was familiar to Daisy. She knew that her mom was hiding something from her, but she'd only seen it when she was hiding something small like the cookies in the jar or the spell book for her own good. She never went out of her way to hide something as big as this. Why is she doing this now? "I don't think you should know this information," Mal said. "It could be dangerous for you." "Fine," Daisy said seriously. "What are we going to do?" "We aren't going to do anything," Mal said sternly with a raised brow. "I'm going to go find him." "I want to go too," Daisy demanded. "I could help you." "Daisy, no. You could get hurt, and I wouldn't be able to live with myself if you did," her mom said. "What I say is final." Rather than argue, Daisy stayed shut and nodded, only half listening to what her mom was telling her. She heard snippets here and there about how she was going to have bodyguards from now on until they found out who kidnapped King Ben. Until then, she was going to have glorified babysitters. They were never going to leave her side. But Daisy had other plans. She refused to sit back and watch as her kingdom and family were being torn apart by this mysterious person. And if her mom thought she was going to hide away, she was wrong. Once Mal was satisfied, she walked Daisy to her room in the academy. In front of the doors stood two guards, Harry Hook and Gil. Back in the day, they were her mom's enemies, but now they were her trusted friends. "Please keep her safe," Mal said to Harry. "I'm trusting you." "Of course," Harry Hook said, his accent thick as he spoke. Before Mal left, she placed a big kiss on her forehead and whispered an "I love you" in her ear. When she left and Daisy was all alone in her room, she prepared herself. Changing out of her long dress, she put on a jumpsuit that was similar to her mom's clothing and packed her spellbook. "Here goes nothing," she whispered to herself before climbing out of the window and onto the ground floor. Since the school was empty and deserted, she knew that she would be okay. There would be no one to see her, which meant she couldn't get caught yet. As she ran down the hallway, she found her mom, Evie, Carlos, and Jay hanging around together. It was what Daisy expected. If there was a mission, her mom and friends would be the first to do this together. Daisy made sure to stay hidden in the shadows, watching them carefully, and made sure they couldn't get out of her sight. Then she heard her mom's voice speak. "Wait, there's someone following us." Her mom was too good. Stepping out of the shadows, she said, "Hi, Mom." Mal smiled, shaking her head at her daughter. Evie laughed and said, "She is related to you, huh?" "Sorry, Mom," Daisy said, "but I just can't sit back here and not help." She thought that her mom would be upset or angry at her for betraying her trust and disobeying orders, but instead Mal laughed and said, "I should have known. It's what I would have done at your age, too." "Does that mean I can help you?" Daisy asked hopefully. Mal crossed her arms over her chest, shaking her head. Daisy could tell that she was about to say no before Carlos stepped in and said, "She's just going to sneak out again. This way you can at least keep an eye on her and be sure she won't get into trouble." "Fine," Mal said. Her eyes glowed green, which happened when she was being serious. This meant no games were going to be tolerated from Daisy. "But you do as I say, and you stick close to me. Am I understood?" "Yes," Daisy said, her voice serious. On the surface, she was serious, but deep down, she was ecstatic that she was going to be going on a big mission. She wanted to jump with joy and giggle. But if she did, she was afraid she'd make her mom angry. When Mal turned back, Jay whispered to her, "Welcome to the team, kid." "Thanks, Uncle Jay." "Okay, here's the plan," Mal said. "Evie, Carlos, and Jay, you guys stay here in Aradon and run the council. I hope that the whole place isn't up in flames when I get back. Daisy and I are going to the Isle of the Lost and have a chat with a few suspects, okay?" Everyone nodded. Their faces were serious as they turned on their heels and did what Mal told them to do. Mal had brought out her motorcycle and told Daisy to get on. She held on tightly to her mom's waist as she sped off down the bridge to the Isle of the Lost. As they got closer to the island, she saw that it was full of bustling business. Based on the stories her mother told her, Daisy knew that this wasn't the place to fool around, even if the place had grown and become better. There were still people who acted naughty here. She had to be careful or someone might steal her belongings. Mal could only protect her for so long. "Come with me," Mal said, as she went down the buildings and into the Lady Tremaine Salon. "We're going to visit Dizzy." Dizzy was a good friend of her mom's, and she had done Daisy's hair and makeup since she was younger. Nobody could do it like how Dizzy could. When they got up into the store, the salon was full of crazy and bright colors as a short girl stood in the middle of the room. Mal smiled and said, "Dizzy!" The girl looked up from the sketchbook and smiled. She said, "Mal, I wasn't expecting you so soon. I thought we agreed you needed a touch-up in 2 weeks." "Sadly, this isn't about my hair," Mal said, her smile vanishing from her face. She looked around before whispering, "My husband's been kidnapped. I was hoping you'd have heard about something." "Not again," Dizzy said, shaking her head. "No, I haven't heard of anything. Everything here has been pretty good, and nobody's been behaving badly." "That's what I thought," Mal said, her hands on her hips. "Do you have any ideas?" Daisy asked, finally speaking up. This was her time to shine and help her mom. She knew that she could do a good job. "Oh, Daisy, your purple hair is looking so good." "And no, I have no idea," Dizzy said as she smiled at her. Then she became serious and looked at Mal. "Maybe you should talk to Maleficent. I guess it's time for a family reunion," Mal said. Daisy could feel her mom's stress even from a few steps behind her. They were about to go see Maleficent for the first time since she was released and allowed back onto the Isle of the Lost. She could remember when Ben and Mal decided to allow her back to society, hoping that she wouldn't cause a ruckus or destroy something. It had been Ben's idea, though Mal had declined, saying it was too dangerous. If this lead turned out to be true, and Maleficent was the one who kidnapped her dad, then it would be sad to say that Mal was right. This would be Daisy's first time meeting her grandmother. Mal had adamantly refused to ever let them meet or talk. Daisy wasn't sure if she ever wanted to meet her in the first place. It would also be Mal's first time visiting her since her release, and it was clear to Daisy that it was taking a toll on her mother. Would she be able to face her after all these years? "Are you okay?" Daisy probed her mom. She couldn't help but feel worried about her. After all, how would she feel if she had to visit her evil mother? Of course, Mal said, though she sounded the opposite of okay. Daisy knew her well enough to know that she was lying. She just wanted to seem tough for her. All Daisy wanted was to tell her that it was okay, to ask for her help and to rely on her, but she couldn't get those words out. The two women arrived at Mal's old home, the one she had left back in her old Auradon prep days. Her mother had missed the Isle of the Lost, but never her time with Maleficent. That much Daisy knew. How horrible could her grandma be? She couldn't be that bad, right? She was reminded of all the stories she'd heard from Mal, Audrey, and Aurora. Those stories brought her nightmares when she was a child. Maybe they were right about her grandmother, or maybe her grandmother had learned her lesson. They were about to find out which one it was. "You're not going in," Mal said as she whipped around to meet Daisy's eyes. Her eyes flashed a bright green once again. She was absolutely serious about this demand. "Do you hear me? You're not going in at all, okay?" "Okay," Daisy said, nodding. Her mom raised an eyebrow at her as she tightened her lips. "I promise, I won't go in." "Good." With that, Mal left her waiting outside. Daisy had lost count of how long it had been since her mom had left her waiting. She had paced back and forth enough times to have gotten tired of it. She had gotten to pick up rocks and throwing them around to whatever was nearest, hoping to hit something. Her nerves and anxieties were getting the best of her. "Where is she?" Daisy muttered under her breath. As she spoke, she heard several loud crashes coming from Maleficent's home. Daisy gasped as she saw flashes of green and purple light, which could only mean one thing. Mom and Grandma were fighting. Now Daisy had a choice. She could ignore her mother's orders and go in to help her, or she could follow her mom's commands and wait here, not knowing if her mother was okay. Naturally, she went against her mother's wishes. Sneaking inside Maleficent's home, she peeped her head around the corner to see that her grandmother was in her dragon form, holding Mal against the wall. "How dare you come in here and accuse me of something I didn't do?" Maleficent hissed at Mal. "I ought to keep you here trapped just for that." "Must you be so dramatic?" Mal asked her mom. Daisy had to suppress a smile as she overheard their conversation. She couldn't help but root for her mom. She watched as Mal struggled to get herself free, even with her magic. Maleficent was too strong. She knew she had to do something, anything, but what? Daisy took a deep breath, focusing on her magic. She knew exactly the spell to use. She took a step out and chanted, "Hush, mother dearest, I demand you sleep. Off you go before I weep." As she did her incantation, a green mist surrounded her and Maleficent, who screamed before turning back into her human form, falling asleep in a curled-up position. Her grandmother snored loudly at Mal's feet. Daisy hadn't been certain if her magic would work, but she was glad it did. "Your magic?" Mal gasped as she stared at her daughter. "You did it!" "Wait, you're not mad at me for disobeying you?" Daisy asked as she narrowed her eyes at her mom, suspicious of this behavior. "Oh, I'm definitely mad," Mal said seriously. "But first things first, I'm so proud of you. That was a hard spell to do, too. You've got the makings of a fine magic user." Daisy smiled, feeling satisfied at her own magic for working. It was a big jump from turning someone into a gerbil and almost setting someone's hair on fire. She could feel her magic coursing through her veins, no longer feeling weak or afraid of it. Was she able to do this solely to save her mother? Or will she be able to harness her magic from now on? Daisy figured she'd only be able to tell when the time came down to, but for now, she'd celebrate her win. "Did you believe her?" Daisy asked her mom, pointing at Maleficent, who was still fast asleep. "Do you think she was telling the truth?" "I don't know," Mal said. "Your grandmother isn't known for being kind-hearted or honest." "So we're at a dead end?" Daisy asked, feeling hopeless in her search for finding her father. "What do we do now?" Mal sat silently, lost in thought, as she thought about Daisy's question. What is there to do now? Maleficent was their only lead. Perhaps there's a slim chance that she didn't take Ben, but there's a high chance she knows something about it. She said, "I need your help." Daisy perked up as she heard her mom ask her for help. This was such a rare experience for her. Her mother was always tough and rarely asked for anything from anyone. Daisy didn't think she'd seen her rely on anyone besides her husband. It was surprising to hear those words come out of her mother's mouth if she were honest. "What are we going to do?" Daisy asked, nodding. She felt sure in herself. If it was to save her father and help her mother, she knew she could do anything. There was no way she was going to let them down. She wouldn't let that happen. "I'll do anything." "It's going to be dangerous and probably stupid," Mal said, looking at her in the eye, making sure Daisy was up to the task. "Are you sure you want to do this?" "What is it?" Daisy asked. Her mother was making her anxious, but she remained steady about her willingness to help. "Whatever it is, I'm in." "We're going to wake up my mother," Mal said. Daisy and her mother had set Maleficent up while she slept. It had been a hard task since her grandmother had been heavier than expected, but they made it work nonetheless. Maleficent snored as she sat in her chair. "Do you want to do the honors of waking her up?" Mal turned to Daisy, who grinned at her mother. "Boy, do I," she said as excitement flooded her chest. This would be another attempt at using magic, and hopefully it went smoothly. After all, she did need the practice. She looked at her grandmother, who looked so peaceful in the state that she was in, but was reminded of the dragon she had been earlier. Daisy turned to look at her mom and said, "But what if I mess up?" Mal grabbed her by the shoulders and stared at her with love and pride. She said, "Don't be scared, okay? I'm right here if anything goes south. Not even your grandmother could take on the two of us." Daisy felt herself relax, nodding at her mom. Mal smiled at her reassuringly before motioning for her to do the spell on her mom. She walked over to the chair that Maleficent was resting in and whispered in her ear, wake up, hear my call. Wake up, before you fall." She could feel the power surging through her as she chanted the spell. She glanced in the mirror behind Maleficent to see that her eyes were the same green as her mother and grandmother. Her mother gasped and clapped her hands excitedly, whispering, "Good job, Daisy." Maleficent began stirring, groaning as she woke up. Her eyes opened, though she still looked sleepy. She glanced at Mal and looked over at Daisy with a smile on her face. "Is this my granddaughter?" Maleficent asked Mal before turning her head to face Daisy. She spoke to her. "I'm assuming you're the one who cast the sleeping spell. Your magic is powerful yet untamed. I'm almost impressed by it, actually." Daisy shifted her weight from one foot to the other, unsure about how to respond to her grandmother. This was her first time meeting her in person, and not just through stories. Luckily, she didn't have to respond as Mal stepped in front of her, shielding her from Maleficent. "Mother, I'm going to ask you again. Where is Ben?" Mal asked as she leaned closer to Maleficent. Daisy could tell that her grandmother was too tired to use her magic, which shocked her. How strong had the spell been? "I don't know," Maleficent said, shrugging with a smirk on her face. "I know you know," Mal said, meeting her mother's eyes. Both of their eyes glowed bright green as they stared at each other. They were having a battle of power between each other. Maleficent was still weak, though. Instead, she turned her head away from Mal and tried to get a better view of Daisy. "I've heard your name was Daisy," Maleficent said sweetly to her. "Mal, you're being rude. Introduce me to my granddaughter already." Mal took a deep breath and stepped aside, gesturing for Daisy to talk to Maleficent. Anxiety filled Daisy as she met her grandmother for the first time, but she knew that she couldn't be afraid. Her mother wouldn't let anything happen to her. "Where is my father?" Daisy asked, her voice shaking as she spoke. Maleficent grinned as she heard Daisy's voice. "You've grown so big," Maleficent said, ignoring her question. "I've dreamt of meeting you. Mal has kept us apart for so long." "Don't make me ask again," Daisy said as she glared at her grandmother. Why was she ignoring her question? "Fine," Maleficent said. "I'll tell you where he is on one condition." Mal narrowed her eyes at her mother. She crossed her arms over her chest with a raised brow. "What's the condition?" "I get to see my granddaughter once a week," Maleficent said. "It'll be a binding oath." "No," Mal said, shaking her head. "I will not allow that to happen, ever." Daisy widened her eyes as she heard her mom. How could she say no? She whispered to her, Mom, can we talk privately, please? Her mother glanced at her and back at Maleficent, who shrugged at her. Mal walked over to the side with Daisy, and once they were sure that Maleficent couldn't hear them, Daisy spoke. I think we should take the deal. No, Mal said, it's too dangerous. It'll only be once a week, Daisy said. She glanced back at her grandmother, who was staring at her nails. Maleficent didn't strike her as someone who was going to do evil anymore, just someone who wanted to spend time with her granddaughter. She said, maybe Dad was right. Maybe she's changed for the better. You sure are Ben's daughter, all right, Mal said with a small smile on her face. She said, fine, we'll do this your way. They both walked back to Maleficent, who perked up at the sight of them. Mal stood in front of her and said, we'll take the deal, but only if I'm there as a supervisor. If I'm not there, no deal. Sounds good to me, Maleficent said, nodding. Daisy watched as Maleficent stood and extended her arm to Mal. They grabbed each other's hands and chanted, a binding deal cannot be broken. A binding deal has been spoken. After they did their spell, Maleficent and Mal looked drained of their magic. They both looked gray in the face and were out of breath. It was unlike anything Daisy had ever seen before. Worried, she grabbed her mom by the waist, holding her up. Daisy asked her mom, is everything all right? It's a powerful spell, young one, Maleficent said. It'll take us some time to regain our strength. Yes, my love, Mal said as she wrapped her arms around Daisy's shoulders. We're okay, just exhausted now. You have your deal, Daisy said to Maleficent. Where is my father? The evil queen and Jafar took him, Maleficent said. They put him in the evil queen's mirror. It took serious magic. Why would they take him? Daisy asked, confused. She couldn't think of any reason why they would bother to take her father. After all, her mom and father were lenient on them, even after all the ruckus they caused many years ago. They wanted their happy endings too, Maleficent said, wincing with every breath she took. They feel like their children were stolen from them. You see, after your mother and her friends left the Isle, they never visited us. They never came by to us. I grew years without seeing my own granddaughter. Shouldn't we be allowed to see our families too? At that moment, Daisy understood why Maleficent struck a deal with them. All she wanted was a relationship with Daisy, which was something she felt that was taken away from them. It was something everybody should have the opportunity of having, knowing and loving their families. She watched as Mal looked at her feet. Disappointment was written all over her face. Let's go find your father, she said to her daughter. We must go together, Maleficent said, standing from her chair. Their magic is far too strong and you're too weak. Daisy is the strongest of us. Mal took a deep breath and said, Okay, we go together, but no funny business. Let's go get Dad, Daisy said, grinning at her mother and grandmother. Daisy rolled her eyes as her mother and grandmother bickered about everything. They fought the whole way about where to go and how to get there. It was funny at first, but it was going on too long, and it was giving her a headache. They were both stubborn and wanted to be in charge. No wonder they didn't get along. Please stop arguing, she said, sighing heavily. Mal glanced back at her, smiled, and looked at Maleficent, who was smiling just the same. They both nodded and said at the same time, We can try. That was the first time you guys agreed on anything this entire time, Daisy said, feeling better about this trip. Maleficent laughed loudly at what Daisy said, nodding. Let's figure out where to go now, okay? Mal and Maleficent spoke briefly about where Jafar and the Evil Queen were. They had been hiding out in a small house, not far from Maleficent's house. They both agreed on a way to get there and led the way until they stared at the house that they were supposed to be hiding out in. The three of them stood outside and said, Let's do this now. They all burst into the house. Jafar and the Evil Queen were standing in the middle, waiting for them. It took you guys long enough, Jafar said. I was beginning to wonder if you guys were ever going to find us. Let go of the king, Mal said to them. Or what? The Evil Queen laughed. You look so weak right now. You too, Maleficent. You two were so powerful. What happened? There's nothing you can do to stop us, Jafar said as he raised his staff and slammed it onto the ground. A red beam hit her mother and grandmother, making them freeze in place, unable to move. Daisy screamed as she saw them. Their magic was still too weak to do anything about it. Jafar and the evil queen looked at Daisy and said, "Oh, who's this? The princess?" "What a beauty," the evil queen said as she stared at her. "That's too bad." Jafar raised his staff, aiming to hit her, but without thinking, Daisy chanted, "You're mine now, listening to me and bow." As if the staff had a mind of its own, it flew out of Jafar's hand and into Daisy's. Jafar widened his eyes as he saw that she took it with ease. The evil queen gasped and said, "I thought she couldn't use magic." "You were wrong," Daisy said. Her eyes glowed green as she stared at them. She turned to her mother and grandmother, using the staff so they could be released from Jafar's magic. Mal grinned and said, "That's my girl." "Your magic is unbelievable," Maleficent said proudly. Daisy beamed as she heard the compliments from her family. She knew she still had a lot of training to do, but she was glad that she could help them and make her mother proud of her. Daisy faced Jafar and the evil queen and said, "Where is my father?" "In here," the evil queen said, waving her compact mirror at them. "You can't get him." She opened the mirror to show that her father was trapped inside. He was banging his hands against the glass. They could hear him saying, "We can work something out. Please let me go." Daisy felt relieved when she saw that her father was okay. From next to her Mal's side, as she saw him, she said, "Oh, thank goodness, he's okay." Reminded of what Maleficent said, Daisy glanced back at Jafar and the evil queen. She felt sorry for them. After all, they were only doing this because they were angry about not seeing their children and grandchildren. "You know," Daisy started as she put the staff on the ground, kicking it back to Jafar. Mal and Maleficent widened their eyes, gaping at her for giving it back to him. "I know your grandchildren." Jafar and the evil queen paused and glanced at each other before saying anything. Jafar picked up his staff, putting it away like how Daisy hoped he would. The evil queen put the mirror on the table in front of her and said, "How are Evie and my granddaughter?" "Evie is doing good," Mal said with a small smile. She spoke carefully, choosing her words to be perfect. She got married, and they had a beautiful daughter. "Her name is Jade," Daisy said, remembering her friend. "She's one of my best friends and is the funniest person I know. She's also smart and talented." The evil queen smiled, tears filling her eyes. She said, "I haven't heard from them at all." "What about Jay?" Jafar asked. "Is he okay?" "He's doing amazing too," Mal said. Maleficent had been right. All they wanted was to know about their family, the people they hadn't heard from in the longest. Maybe her father was right about everything. All they needed was some love and caring. "He has a son," Daisy added. "His name is Jordan. He's athletic and skilled in many sports. He really takes after his father." "I'm so glad," Jafar said. "Who would have thought? The villains from the old days had a soft spot for their families. Even after all this time, they still cared about them." "I'm sure that if you let go of my father, you guys can work something out." Jafar and the evil queen nodded as they cast a spell that released Daisy's father from the mirror. Daisy and Mal gasped as they saw him standing in front of them, looking around the room confusedly. They ran into his arms, pulling him into a hug. Mal said, "I'm so glad you're safe." "We missed you," Daisy said, smiling. "It's nice to see you, King Ben," Maleficent said, standing in the back. "Nice to see you too," Ben said, nodding at her. He hugged his wife and daughter, smiling. "I missed you too." After they finished, King Ben turned to Jafar and the evil queen. He invited them back to Aradan so they could talk more about the issue and how to fix it. They agreed to come while Mal and Daisy said goodbye to Maleficent. Mal reminded her about their family visit as Maleficent smiled and nodded. "I'll see you soon, little one," Maleficent said as Daisy gave her a big hug. When they said their goodbyes, they made their way back to Aradan. "You did a good job back there," Mal said to Daisy. "You would make a fine queen." Daisy smiled, feeling proud of herself. She could tell that she was making a fine magic user and a decent queen. After all, she said, "Thank you." When they arrived back to Aradan, King Ben and Queen Mal agreed that the families of the villains could meet, if there was supervision and with the agreement that no magic be involved. This treaty made everyone happy. It gave everyone what they wanted. Daisy did well after all. She was no longer the clumsy girl she was before going on this trip. She was growing into the person her parents would be proud of. It was something she was excited about and couldn't wait to tell her best friend. Now, as she sat on the green grass, as she usually did, she saw Jade skip over to where she was with a bright smile on her face. Plopping down to sit next to her, Jade brushed her blue hair over her shoulder. "Seems like you're a big fish now, huh? I knew you had it in ya," Jade said with a giggle. "Now we can definitely try that new spell you found." "I promise I won't turn you into a gerbil," Daisy said, happily despite the bad feeling in her stomach. She knew that she still had a long way to go, and so did Aradan. She could feel that there was another trouble brewing up, but she couldn't tell what it was. For now, she decided to ignore it. The end.